Chuck Norris pushed through a wall of branches and stopped cold. A woman was suspended upside down from a massive oak, her ankles bound with rope, her face purple and swollen as she gasped for air. He grabbed her body with both arms and ripped the knotted cord apart with his bare hands before she could lose consciousness, lowering her to the ground as the crew came crashing through the brush behind him. What happened in the next 48 hours would become Hollywood legend, a story whispered about for decades. Chuck Norris grabbed the woman's ankle with both hands and pulled. Her body swung hard against the trunk of a 60-foot oak, and the rope around her feet tightened so fast it cut through her boot leather like a blade through wet paper. What happened in the next 45 minutes on that remote Texas hillside would become film set legend, a story whispered about for decades by stunt coordinators, crew members, and one very shaken actress who never forgot the man who saved her life. Let me take you there. It's 1984. Deep in the brush country south of Brackettville, Texas, on the set of a low-budget action film called Lone Wolf MC Quaid. Now, if you know that movie, you know it launched Chuck Norris from karate tournament champion into genuine leading man territory. But what you don't know, what almost nobody outside that crew ever talked about publicly, is what happened on day 19 of a 30-day shoot, when a routine stunt went catastrophically wrong and Chuck Norris stopped being an actor and started being the only person within a quarter mile who knew how to keep someone alive. The woman's name was Karen Shepard, 5'6", 120 pounds, a legitimate martial artist in her own right. She held black belts in 2 disciplines and had done stunt work on a handful of projects before landing a small role in this film. She wasn't some helpless bystander. This was a woman who could throw a spinning heel kick at head height without blinking. But when you're hanging upside down from a sabotage stunt rig 50 feet off the ground, and the blood is rushing to your skull so fast your vision is going purple at the edges, it doesn't matter how many belts you have. You're dying, and you're dying fast. Here's the setup. The scene called for Karen's character to be captured by the villain's men and strung up from a tree branch as bait for Norris's character. Standard action movie stuff. The stunt coordinator, a guy named Dean Ferrandini, had rigged a harness system that was supposed to hold Karen at about 12 feet off the ground, completely safe, with a crash pad underneath and 2 crew members on the guide rope. Easy day. Except someone swapped the rope. I swear this happened. The night before the shoot, somebody replaced the rigging rope with a thinner gauge line. Nobody noticed during the morning safety check because the replacement looked almost identical. Same color, same weave pattern, but it was rated for about half the weight capacity. The crew ran through the setup, hoisted Karen into position, and for the first take, everything seemed fine. She hung there. Camera rolled. Norris walked into frame, delivered his line, and the director called cut. Second take. They hoisted her up again, this time higher. The director wanted more visual drama, wanted her really dangling up there against the sky. So the crew pulled the rope until Karen was roughly 30 feet above the ground. Her face was already getting red. Blood pooling. That's normal for an inversion stunt. You've got maybe 4 to 5 minutes before it starts getting dangerous. Everyone knew the clock. Then the rope slipped. Not broke. Slipped. The thinner line couldn't hold the friction lock on the branch, and Karen dropped about 8 feet in a single jolt before the rope caught again. The crash pad was no longer underneath her. She'd swung sideways on the drop and was now hanging over bare rocky ground with scrub brush and jagged limestone underneath. The crew on the guide rope lost their grip entirely. The line burned through their gloves and the tail end whipped free. Karen screamed. Not a movie scream. The kind of sound that makes every person on a film set stop pretending they're making art and remember they're standing in the real world where people break and bleed. Get this, the whole crew froze. 30-something professionals, men and women who'd worked on action pictures for years, and every single one of them locked up, because nobody had planned for this. The safety protocols assumed the rope would hold. The crash pad was 15 feet away from where Karen was now swinging. And she was still rising, believe it or not, because the rope was threading itself over the branch, the friction pulling her higher with each swing of her own body weight. Chuck Norris didn't freeze. He was standing about 40 feet away near the camera truck, holding a cup of coffee. He set the cup down on the hood of the truck, and he walked, not ran, walked, fast, deliberate, straight toward the base of that tree. And the way people who were there describe it, that walk changed the temperature of everything. The panic didn't stop, but it reorganized. People started moving because he was moving. He reached the trunk and looked up. Karen was now somewhere between 35 and 40 feet off the ground, swinging in a slow arc, her face darkening, her hands clawing at the rope around her ankles. She was trying to do a sit-up to reach the binding, but the swinging made it impossible. Every time she curled up, the momentum threw her back down. Norris grabbed the trunk. Now this was a live oak, the kind of tree that grows wide and twisted in the Texas hill country. The bark is rough, the branches are thick, and the first limb was about 10 feet up. Chuck Norris was 44 years old. He had a torn rotator cuff in his left shoulder that he'd been hiding from the production insurance team, and he started climbing that tree with his bare hands. No harness, no rope, no safety equipment of any kind. Believe me when I tell you that the assistant director, a man named Gene Davis, ran toward the tree yelling for Norris to stop. Davis was screaming that they'd get the fire department, they'd get a cherry picker, they'd figure something out. Norris didn't look down, didn't acknowledge him. Just kept pulling himself up branch by branch, hand over hand, his boots scraping bark, his bad shoulder working a job it had no business doing. Meanwhile, Karen was losing consciousness. At the angle she was hanging, with her head below her heart and no ability to control her position, she had maybe 3 minutes before she'd pass out completely. And once she passed out, her body would go limp, and the involuntary muscle contractions that were actually helping keep a tiny bit of pressure off the rope would stop. The full dead weight would hit that compromise line, and it would either snap and drop her 40 feet onto limestone, or it would hold and she'd hang there unconscious, while the blood pressure in her brain climbed toward stroke territory. Neither option ended well. Here's what nobody tells you about Chuck Norris. The man was not reckless. Every person who ever trained with him described the same thing: calculated, methodical. He didn't do anything without knowing his exit. So when he climbed that tree, he wasn't being a cowboy. He was solving a physics problem in real time while pulling himself up the side of a tree with a shoulder that felt like someone was driving a railroad spike through it. He reached the branch, the main limb where the rope was looped. He was now about 40 feet up, straddling a branch that was maybe 10 inches in diameter, looking down at Karen Shepard hanging 6 feet below him, swinging, her eyes half closed, her lips moving but no sound coming out. He talked to her. "Karen, open your eyes. Look at me." She opened her eyes, barely. "I need you to stop swinging. Spread your arms out. Go still." She spread her arms. The air resistance wasn't much, but it was enough. Her arc shortened. She slowed. Norris pulled a folding knife from his back pocket. A buck 110, the classic lockback that half the men in Texas carried in 1984. He opened it with one hand, holding the branch with the other, and he leaned down toward the rope. Now here's where it gets complicated, and trust me on this, because the geometry matters. If he cut the rope, she'd fall 40 feet, dead. If he tried to pull her up by the rope, his shoulder would give out and they'd both go down. He needed a third option, and he had about 90 seconds to find it. He found it. He yelled down to the crew, "Get the crash pad under her. Now, move it. 20 feet to your left." 4 crew members grabbed the pad and started dragging it across the rocky ground. Dean Ferrandini was shouting coordinates. The pad wasn't big enough to guarantee a safe landing from that height, but it was something. Then Norris did something that the stunt coordinator later said was either the smartest or the craziest thing he'd ever seen on a film set. He didn't cut the rope at the top. He lowered himself down the branch until he was hanging by his knees, upside down himself, face to face with Karen, and he cut the rope 6 inches above her ankle binding. But he didn't cut all the way through. He cut about 80% of the fibers, leaving a thin strand holding. "When I tell you," he said, looking directly into her eyes from 18 inches away, both of them upside down, blood rushing, "You tuck and roll, you hear me?" She nodded. Her face was almost purple. He looked down. The crash pad was close, not perfect, close. "Move it 2 feet right," he shouted. His voice was strained. "Hanging upside down from his knees on a branch 40 feet up will do that." The crew adjusted. He looked at Karen one more time. "Ready?" She whispered something he couldn't hear. He flicked the knife across the remaining fibers. The rope snapped. Karen dropped. And I mean dropped. 40 feet of pure gravity, arms tucked, body rotating, and she hit that crash pad slightly off center, her shoulder taking the initial impact, her body rolling exactly the way a trained martial artist rolls when they're thrown, and she tumbled off the edge of the pad onto the ground. She didn't move. The set went silent. Every person held their breath. Ferrandini was the first one to reach her. He knelt down, put 2 fingers on her neck, and after 3 seconds that felt like 300 years, he looked up at the crew and nodded. She was alive, unconscious, but alive. Now here's the part that really gets me. Chuck Norris was still up in that tree, hanging upside down from his knees, alone 40 feet up, and his left shoulder, the torn one, had just given out completely. He couldn't pull himself back up to the branch. He was stuck, hanging by his legs, and nobody on the ground was paying attention because every eye was on Karen. Gene Davis looked up and saw him. He said later that the sight nearly stopped his heart. Chuck Norris, the toughest guy on any set he'd ever worked, hanging upside down from a tree branch with one arm dangling limp at his side, completely silent, not calling for help, just hanging there, trying to figure out his next move. Davis started screaming for a ladder. There wasn't one on set. They were in the middle of nowhere, Texas. The nearest structure was a ranch house 2 miles down a dirt road. Norris solved it himself. He swung his good arm up, grabbed the branch, and through what multiple witnesses described as an almost inhuman effort, he pulled himself upright using only his right arm and his core strength. He sat on the branch for about 10 seconds, breathing, his left arm hanging at his side, and then he climbed down, one-armed, 40 feet of rough oak, finding footholds by feel, gripping branches with one hand, lowering himself section by section. He reached the ground and walked to where Karen was lying. The set medic had her conscious now. She was crying, not from pain, but from the adrenaline dump, that full body shaking that happens when your nervous system realizes it just barely survived something. Norris knelt beside her. He put his good hand on her shoulder, and he said something that only she and the medic heard. He said, "I've got you. It's done." That was it. 5 words, no speech, no tough guy moment, just a man telling a woman she was safe. Now you want to know what happened next, because the stunt going wrong was just the beginning of this story. The real question, the one that turned this from a film set accident into a full-blown legend, was this: who switched the rope? And that's where things get dark. Ferrandini pulled the broken rope from the tree and examined it within the hour. He knew immediately it wasn't his rope. He'd personally inspected and tagged every piece of rigging equipment on that production. The rope that was supposed to be on that tree was a 1/2-inch braided nylon rated for 800 pounds. What he found was a 3/8-inch line rated for 400. Close enough to fool a visual check, different enough to fail under stress. He brought it to Norris. Norris looked at it. He turned it over in his hand. And then he asked one question. Who had access to the rigging truck last night? Ferrandini knew exactly who. 3 people had keys. Himself, the assistant stunt coordinator, a guy I'll call Ray, and the transportation captain. Norris stood up. His left arm was in a makeshift sling that the medic had put together. He walked across the set toward the rigging truck. Ferrandini followed. The rest of the crew watched. Ray was sitting in a folding chair near the truck, smoking a cigarette. When he saw Norris and Ferrandini approaching, he stood up. I want you to picture this. A man with a bad shoulder, still covered in bark scrapes and sweat, walking directly toward you with a look on his face that makes the air feel different. Ray, Norris said, open the truck. Ray's hand shook when he unlocked it. Inside, Ferrandini found the original rope, coiled neatly, set aside, hidden behind a stack of equipment cases. The tags were still on it, his tags. Norris looked at Ray. Didn't say a word, just looked at him. And I have to tell you, the people who witnessed this said it was scarier than any fight scene they'd ever filmed, because Norris wasn't performing. This was real. Ray started talking. Fast. The kind of talking people do when the walls close in and there's nowhere left to go. He said it was a mistake. He said he'd been trying to reorganize the equipment and grabbed the wrong rope. He said he didn't know the difference. He said a lot of things. Norris listened. His jaw tightened. He shifted his weight forward onto the balls of his feet, and Ray took a step back. Here's the thing. Ray was lying, and everyone knew it, including Norris, because you don't accidentally hide the correct rope behind equipment cases. You don't accidentally coil it neatly and tuck it away where no one would find it during a morning check. That's not a mistake. That's a plan. The real story came out over the next 48 hours, and man, This is where it gets ugly. Ray had a grudge, not against Karen, against Ferrandini. The two of them had worked together on a previous production where Ferrandini had reported Ray for cutting safety corners. That report had cost Ray a job on a major studio film. He'd been blacklisted for 6 months. He blamed Ferrandini for nearly ending his career. So Ray decided to sabotage a stunt. Not to hurt anyone, he claimed later. Just to make Ferrandini look incompetent. Just to make it look like the great Dean Ferrandini had missed a safety check. If the rope slipped a little, if the stunt went slightly wrong, Ferrandini would take the blame. He'd be the one answering questions. He'd be the one getting reported this time. Ray never counted on the rope slipping the way it did. Never counted on Karen swinging over bare ground. Never counted on the situation escalating to the point where a woman was minutes from a stroke or a 40-foot fall onto limestone. He definitely never counted on Chuck Norris climbing a tree one arm to cut her down. You know what gets me about people who do things like this? They always think they can control the outcome. They always think they know exactly how far the dominoes will fall. And they never, ever account for the moment when physics and luck and gravity stop cooperating with their little plan. Norris called a full production shutdown. This was 1984, a low-to-budget action film. Every day of shutdown cost money the production could not afford. The producers pushed back hard. They wanted to keep shooting. They wanted to deal with the rope issue after wrap. Norris walked into the production trailer. 4 producers sitting around a folding table. He stood in the doorway, his arm in a sling, and he said, "We shut down until every piece of equipment on this set is inspected, or I walk, your call." They shut down. For 2 days, Ferrandini and a team went through every harness, every rope, every cable, every carabiner on the production. They found 2 other pieces of equipment that had been tampered with, a cable on a vehicle stunt rig that had been partially frayed, a harness buckle that had been loosened. All in areas where Ferrandini's work would be blamed. Ray was fired. He was escorted off the set by 2 Kinney County Sheriff's deputies. The production filed a report. Karen Shepard, once she was released from the hospital in Del Rio where she'd been treated for a mild concussion and severe bruising, gave a statement. Now here's where it takes a turn that surprised everyone. The production's lawyers wanted to keep the whole thing quiet. Standard Hollywood damage control. No press. No police investigation beyond the initial report. Settle with Karen. Move on. Norris refused. He personally drove to the Kinney County Sheriff's Office and pushed for a criminal investigation. He sat in a plastic chair in that tiny office and told the sheriff everything. He told him about the rope, about the hidden equipment, about the other tampered rigs. He told him that a woman almost died because one man decided his grudge was more important than another person's life. The sheriff, a man named Norman Houghton, opened a criminal negligence investigation. It took months. It went through the local DA. And in the end, Ray pleaded no contest to a charge of reckless endangerment. He received probation and was permanently banned from working on any production covered by IATSA, the stagehands union. It wasn't a long prison sentence. It wasn't a dramatic courtroom victory. But it was accountability. And Chuck Norris made it happen by refusing to let the machine sweep it under the rug. And honestly, that's the part of this story most people miss. They hear Chuck Norris climbed a tree and saved a woman, and they think it's another action hero anecdote, another tough guy story. But the real test of who Norris was didn't happen in that tree. It happened in a production trailer when he stared down 4 producers who wanted to keep shooting. It happened in a sheriff's office when he sat in a plastic chair and demanded that the system do its job. Mark my words, that's the difference between a movie hero and a real one. A movie hero punches the bad guy and the credits roll. A real hero does the boring, uncomfortable, career-risking work of making sure it never happens again. Karen Shepard recovered fully. She went on to have a solid career in martial arts films throughout the 80s and 90s. She appeared in films alongside Cynthia Rothrock, did stunt coordination work, and became a respected figure in the martial arts community. She rarely talked about the incident publicly, but in a 2003 interview with a martial arts magazine, she said something that stuck with me. She said, "Chuck didn't just save my life that day, he saved my faith in people. Because after it happened, every single person around me wanted to pretend it didn't. He was the only one who said no." Now let me tell you what happened to Chuck's shoulder. Because this matters. The torn rotator cuff that he'd been hiding from the production insurance got significantly worse during the climb. He finished the remaining 11 days of the shoot with a shoulder that was, by his own later admission, barely functional. He did his own fight scenes. He did his own stunts. He worked through it because he'd given his word that the film would get finished, and Chuck Norris did not break his word. After Wrap, he had surgery. 6 months of rehabilitation. He came back for Missing in Action, which became a massive hit, and the rest of the decade belonged to him. But every fight scene, every kick, every time you saw him throw that famous roundhouse in any film from 1984 onward, he was doing it with a shoulder that had been rebuilt because he'd climbed a tree to save a woman he barely knew. He never mentioned it in interviews, never used it as a talking point, never leveraged it for publicity. The production kept it quiet, and Norris saw no reason to change that. He wasn't interested in being a hero in the press. He was interested in being one when it counted. And you know what? Let me say this right now. If this story hit you the way it hit me, if you're the kind of person who wants to hear about the moments that don't make the highlight reel, the real ones, the ones that happen when the cameras are off and the script doesn't have a good ending yet, then hit that subscribe button, because this channel exists because of people who want the truth behind the legend. One click. That's all it takes. Let's keep going. Ferrandini never forgot what Norris did. The two of them worked together on 3 more films over the next decade. Every time, Ferrandini would tell the new crew the same thing during the first safety briefing. He'd say, "I've worked with the toughest men in this business, and the toughest one I ever met is the one who shut down a production to protect people he'd never see again after Wrap." There's one more piece to this that I need you to hear. About a year after the incident, Norris was at a martial arts expo in Los Angeles. Signing autographs, doing demonstrations, the usual circuit. A man walked up to his table, average build, nervous, hands in his jacket pockets. It was Ray. The security team moved forward. Norris waved them off. He looked at Ray and waited. Ray said, "I came to apologize. What I did was wrong. I know that. I've known it every day since." Norris studied him. The man standing across the table was not the cocky stunt coordinator from the Texas set. This was someone hollowed out by consequence, by the slow, grinding weight of knowing you almost killed someone because you couldn't let go of a grudge. This is the moment of vulnerability that makes Norris more than a tough guy, because what he did next was harder than climbing any tree. He stood up, he extended his right hand, and he shook Ray's hand. He didn't say, "I forgive you." He didn't give a speech. He just shook the man's hand, looked him in the eye for about 3 seconds, and sat back down. And let me tell you something about that handshake. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't Hollywood magnanimity. It was a man deciding in real time that he'd already fought the fight that needed fighting. The investigation was done. The accountability was delivered. The system had done its job because he'd forced it to. There was nothing left to punish. And Norris had never been the kind of man who enjoyed punishment for its own sake. Ray left the expo. He never worked in film again. He moved to Arizona and took a job in construction. That's the last anyone in the industry heard of him. A career ended not by a punch or a lawsuit, but by the quiet, permanent consequence of a choice he could never undo. Lone Wolf MC Quaid came out in 1983 and became a cult classic. It launched Norris into the stratosphere. It gave him the leverage to make the films that defined his career. But if you watch it closely, if you really pay attention, you'll notice something in the scenes shot after day 19. Norris's left arm doesn't move the same way. In the fight choreography from the first half of the film, he's loose, fluid, both arms working in perfect coordination. In the second half, his right side does most of the work. His left arm stays closer to his body. The kicks compensate. The camera angles adjust. Most viewers never noticed. But once you know the story, you can see it. You can see the cost written into every frame. That's the thing about real courage. It leaves marks. Not the kind you show off. The kind you carry. I've told a lot of stories on this channel. Stories about fighters and champions and people who did incredible things under pressure. But this one sits different for me, because it's not really a story about a man climbing a tree. It's about what happens after. It's about the choices that don't have cameras pointed at them. The ones that don't end with applause. Chuck Norris found a woman hanging upside down from a tree. He climbed up and cut her down. That's the story everyone wants to hear, and it's a good one. But the story that matters is the one where he walked into a trailer and told 4 men with more money and more power than him that they were going to do the right thing. The story where he sat in a sheriff's office and refused to let convenience win. The story where he shook the hand of the man who almost killed someone because the fight was over and there was nothing left to prove. That's not a movie. That's a man. Karen Shepard was asked years later what she remembered most about that day. Not the fall, not the rope, not the hospital. She said she remembered looking up from the ground after she'd landed on the crash pad, still half conscious, the world spinning, and seeing Chuck Norris 40 feet above her, hanging upside down from a branch, one arm dead at his side, completely calm. She said he looked down at her and nodded. Just nodded. And she knew she was going to be okay. That's the legend, not the kick, not the movie, not the meme. A man who climbed a tree with a bad shoulder, cut a stranger loose, hung there alone in silence, and then spent the next year making sure the person responsible couldn't do it again. Some legends are built in arenas. Some are built in octagon cages under bright lights with millions watching. But the best ones, the ones that last, are built in the branches of a Texas oak tree on a Tuesday afternoon when nobody important was watching, and the only audience was a woman who needed someone to show up. Chuck Norris showed up. "She's safe." That's all he said when he reached the ground. 2 words to the medic. Then he walked to the production trailer and went to war for her. That's the legend. And now you know it too.